As far as VLV is concerned, radio has always been an extremely important service for us. We started as just the voice of the listener, and then became the voice of the listener and viewer. And around for all of that time, and a lot of time before that as well, has been Gillian Reynolds, who is also a patron of the VLV. And I'm delighted, therefore, that this last session is featuring radio and is featuring in particular Gillian. Delighted that the session is going to be hosted by, or Gillian will be in conversation with James Naughtie, basically one of the best known broadcasters in the country. Jim, of course, on Radio 4 was presenter for 23 years of the Today programme. He's been presenter of the Book Club since its inception in 1998. He's an author of a range of books, fact and fiction. And I gather the third espionage novel by Jim will be published this year. And I'm looking forward to Jim, as I've read the previous two with great enjoyment. So over to you, Jim.
Colin, thank you very much. That book will be published when it's been written. There we are. Deadlines are part of our lives, aren't they? And it's an enormous pleasure to be joining you at the VLV conference, and be joined by my dog as well, to talk to a very old friend, Gillian Reynolds, who has been Gillian Reynolds, CBE, I should say, who of course is one of the great friends of radio in this country, and has excited us all and occasionally irritated us all over the years since she began writing about radio in The Guardian, and was, of course, hands-on in Liverpool with one of the commercial stations. She was a presenter on radio and on television, but most of all remembered by us all for her incisive commentary, not simply on programmes themselves, but on the behind-the-scenes machinations in radio from the 60s until really today, more or less. Gillian, welcome. It's very nice to see you.
Lovely to see you, Jim.
I wish we could be together, but there we are. We'll be together before long. Look, it's inevitable after an introduction like that we begin with a little bit of history. Where did your excitement about radio come from, and how did it begin?
Well, I grew up with the radio, Jim, because I'm tremendously ancient. I'm 86, so the radio's been part of my life since I was 2, 3. And I remember, I've written about this for the Voice of Listener and Viewer. I remember being called in from playing in the street in 1939, where all my mother's family were gathered around the radio in my grandma's house. And that was because war was being declared, war had been declared. And the radio has been part of my life ever since then, because, you know, television came along in the 50s. There wasn't any competition in radio, really legal competition, much in this country until the 70s. And radio is part of so many lives. Well, you don't need me to tell you, it's the first thing you turn on in the morning, even before you put the kettle on. So it's part of my life, it's part of a lot of people's lives. Audio, as it has become, has a particular power to communicate. And that's what we all, regardless of our age, respond to.
Well, indeed. And when you say audio, Gillian, you really mean words, don't you? Because I think...
No, I don't, Jim.
Oh,
I mean things that you hear. I mean words and music and sounds.
But of course, a good radio piece, I remember being told when I started making radio features, and we'll come to the paucity of radio features in some bits of the output probably later, but I was told that actually when you record a really good feature for radio, if you take out all the words by sort of irritating presenters or reporters, you should be able to hear the journey of the piece from the sounds. I mean, the real majestic people who could make these pieces, both studio managers, but also producers who could cut tape wonderfully with radio blades. You were taken on a sound journey before a word was laid on the tape.
Yes, I've never heard that before, but that's very potent. And I agree with that. I mean, someone like the late, wonderful Piers Plowright would have you in the palm of his hand from the first minute. Yeah. Well,
indeed, that's right. Look, so just taking this historical focus, Gillian, and going back, you wrote for The Guardian in the 60s, but the guts of your career as a radio critic, of course, were on the Telegraph. from 1975 right through like 40 years and more, I think.
42.
42, yes. Exactly. Well, we get these things right. Now, what do you think you were trying to do? Of course, you were trying to give us a commentary day by day on what we should listen to and all the rest of it. But fundamentally, inside your head, what did you want to achieve over the piece?
I wanted always to either share other people's enthusiasms or pass on something that I'd heard that I thought would amuse them. You know, if you're writing for anyone, you want to extend. You want to say, "Come in, hear this, you'll like it." And similarly, you know, people have always written to me. I've got stacks and stacks of letters, and still do, with people saying, "Have you heard so and so?" It's absolutely wonderful. And for instance, last week I've decided that I'm never going to go through an airport again. So anything I do in the way of vacation is going to be in the UK. And I went up to Liverpool to see my family there, but I booked myself into the Liverpool Playhouse to see a one-night stand from John Shuttleworth, a comedian who is he's on television, he's on the stage, he's superb. Graham Fellows, that is the originator of it. But by creating a character in just words and sounds, it seems to me absolute magic. It's like being with a magician, drawing something out of a hat, and you really believe it's flowers, not pieces of paper.
I sympathize with you, by the way, about airports, but let me recommend European trains. But anyway, look, that's a fascinating observation, and it reminds me that, of course, one of the duties of a critic, apart from throwing the odd cabbage when it's required, is to alert people to new talent and to spot the talent that's coming to, and explain really why it works. And of course, in your career, let's go back to the late 60s, early 70s. You've watched some people come from nowhere and create careers which are extraordinary. And I don't mean careers because of the amount of money they've earned, but careers in terms of the way they have got an audience to follow them, to care about them, to laugh and to cry with them. When you look back in the early days, who were the people that you began to feel were really commanding this medium?
Oh, without a doubt, the World of One. It changed everything. It changed current affairs broadcasting at the BBC, very controversially at the time. That was William Hardcastle.
For younger members of the audience, we must recall that Bill Hardcastle, who had been a Fleet Street journalist, edited the Mail and so on.
And the great producer, Andrew Boyle.
A rather different paper from the one it is now. And Andrew Boyle, as you say, I mean, famous to a younger generation for revealing the identity of Anthony Blunt, but they were a formidable combination. And it's important to remember it had never been done before.
Never been done before. It was very controversial at the BBC because it was opinionated. And it was opinionated within strict guidelines, of course. Sure. But you listen to it with a sense of excitement. Alas, I don't get that same sense of excitement now from it. Maybe that's because there's too much competition. I don't think so. I think the nature of the program has changed. But that's the great thing about radio. There is always something new cropping up. For instance, Times Radio, nearly 2 years old, launched into the blue, very expensive actually to do speech radio. The unmissable program on Times Radio is the 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock show with Matt Chorley. It's absolutely unmissable. And that came out of the blue. It has a tone, a style, a sense, all of its own. And it has that same urgency to want to share a story that the old World at One had.
I'm a great admirer of Matt Chorley's, and I think what you've put your finger on there is creating a synthesis, in his case, between a kind of natural humor, because he's a stand-up comedian in a kind of another life, as it were, but also a grip on the news. I mean, he knows what a story is.
He's worked on radio. He's been a DJ.
Sure.
He understands the intimacy. He doesn't shout at you. I mean, some people who transfer to radio from, the higher realms, I will whisper this to you, Andrew Marr could take a few lessons in how to speak in an ordinary voice, talk as if the person you're talking to is the other side of the kitchen table.
I will let that pass without comment, except to say that I think your use of the word intimacy is very important, because I think radio, above all, is an intimate medium. If you're sitting in a darkened studio talking to a microphone, you can't see anyone. You know that with luck, there's a vast horde out there. If you're lucky and it's a well-known program, you can't see any of them. But you're aware that you're talking to individuals, and this is not some sort of corny conception or conceit by a presenter or a reporter.
I think, Jim, you are speaking from...
You're talking to an individual.
I think you're speaking as from personal experience, because you made the great leap from print into audio, into sounds, into radio, when you went to the World at One. Now, you must have had a few tremors of doubt.
Oh, huge tremors of doubt. And, you know, I was a great admirer of the program, as you were. And for goodness sake, I mean, Robin Day had been the previous host. Now, you know, for anyone watching this, I mean, Robin was such a vast figure. I mean, gargantuan figure. I mean, I'd grown up with him. He invented the television political interview. And he had gone from the program, I think, in '87, a year before I joined. And Nick Clark and Brian Widlick had been doing it as a double act for a year. And then Nick and I took over, Nick doing Fridays and The World This Weekend, and I did the daily program Monday to Thursday. And I mean, you did feel this enormous weight coming down, but it was a very venerable broadcaster who's still with us on another show, as it were, who said to me, look, always remember you're talking to somebody sitting in the corner of the room. And it sounds ridiculous and corny, but of course it's absolutely true. That's what you have to do. And yes. I know that that's, Gillian, in all your critiques of individuals and programs over the years, that's what you've been looking for. It's communication, isn't it? Clarity and brightness and intelligence in communication.
Oh, it's tell me something. It's explain something to me. It shares something with me. And I listen to everything. You know, I tune up and down the dial. And the first thing I turn to in the morning, especially if I'm up really early, is Wake Up to Money on 5 Live. It's the most terrific program. I don't know why they don't push it on later. Now you can tell that the 40% cuts in budget that have come in radio have reduced everybody's scan, everybody's sense of purpose. Wow. And it worries me intensely that BBC radio news programs are importing lumps of television stuff. And it's not the same voice. It's not someone talking to me.
Well, let's just talk about that. I want to bring you back. I mean, talking about early morning programs, I often think one of the programs that is perhaps not underrated, but too many people know about it, is Farming Today on Radio 4.
Which it's fabulous.
Extraordinary mine of information, and sometimes not listened to by people in other programs who could usefully pick up some ideas. But you've made a very interesting point there about radio and the sense in which it's now dependent in news coverage for a lot of pieces which are done for television. And you and I both know,
this is BBC Radio.
Yes, that we've got this vast news machine, which is extraordinarily talented and multifaceted. And we can see from the coverage of Ukraine how powerful it can be at moments of difficulty and crisis and complexity. But if you've got a piece which has been recorded for television and it's played on radio without having been re-edited or revoiced or rethought, it isn't made for that medium. And it sounds to people like me and you, it sounds like a square peg in a round hole.
I don't think we're alone here because I think the figures will show it. It's where there is something to say, you want to say it in the most effective way. I mean, if someone comes knocking at your door with something to sell you, you either want the product, more likely you want to hear the sales talk. And in a way, news is very much a sort of buying and selling operation. And I don't think people recognize it as that anymore. They think, because I'm saying it, this is very important. No, I'm the important one. Tell me something in words I will like and understand and respond to.
Well, I think this is music to the ears of people who care about radio, Gillian, and I want to come back to where things stand at the moment and where you think they might go. But before that, I want to continue our sort of chunter through the years, because when you look at the kinds of things that were being done, you know, which have laid the ground for much that's happening today. You've talked about the World at One in News and Current Affairs radio at the BBC. What about the other things, the great documentary makers for radio, for example, that you heard, you know, the pieces from the 70s and the 80s, which I think still for many people shine as examples of what you can do with the medium?
Oh, I served for 20 years on the Charles Parker Archive. Charles Parker and Ewan McCall made these very revolutionary left-wing-ish documentaries with music and words in the late 50s, early 60s. And the battle to get them on was considerable. And when Charles died, he left this massive archive of tapes, bigger than the BBC had kept, because the BBC doesn't keep everything. And it's as well, if you're a radio producer, to keep your own collection under the bed for when you pop off, because someone might want to listen to your work. So trying to get that into digital form, into a form that other generations could appreciate, was 20 years' work. It continues, thank God, because there is something very appealing about just listening. And I will hesitate before I voice this cliche. You know that thing, you know, the scenery is always better. In your head, the pictures are yours. You make them from your own experience. You relate what you're feeling to what you're hearing, and it's a really strong bond. And it continues to this day. I mean, it's the heart and soul of music radio, any kind of music radio, whether it's pop or not. And there are still people who are passionate about that connection, who will come up to you and say, you've got to hear this, you've got to hear this. And it's extraordinary that radio is now taught academically, and kids want to learn how to do it, because it's this primitive thing. I don't know, maybe it goes back to when you're crying in your pram and your mother comes and picks you up. Maybe it goes back to that, but there is something private, personal, and wonderfully productive about the medium of sound.
The good news is that there are many people who still arrive in radio. Many of them, I think probably most of them now, talking from my experience at the BBC, coming from local radio, where there is so much innovation, so much excitement, and coming from offices where sometimes they've had to do everything. You know, They've had to edit it, they've had to talk, they've had to read the news, they've had to do the sport, they've had to give as we used to say in first newspaper I worked for, sub the fish prices, you know, a lot. Now, and so many of them come, and this is the cheering thing, so many of them come in and they love radio, the idea of radio. And if you listen back to some of the great reporters, and I think of my old colleague Hugh Sykes, for example, now retired. Hugh, you talk about the wonderful Parker McCall archives. Hugh used to keep every bit of tape he ever recorded, and we're
very wise,
before the digital period. And he would be wandering around, I don't know, Iran or something, and he'd come back with spools of tape, and he still got them all. And I think there are people today who still feel the same way. But let me take you from the individual and the particular about people who've done great things on radio, Gillian, to the whole structure of the industry, if we can call it that. When you look at it now, and let's take the BBC and the commercial sector separately, because that makes sense. Where do you think things stand? I mean, where do you feel optimistic and where do you feel gloomy? Look at the BBC first.
I wonder if the BBC values radio enough. I hope it does, because it's got the first Director General, and you've heard from him this morning, who has actually done his time in radio. When he came in to the BBC, there was a lot of muttering behind hands, saying, oh, Tim Davie, oh, he's come from Pepsi-Cola, what does he know? Tim Davie is a listener to what people say and a thinker about why they've said it. And he learned a lot in radio. And he learned some of it, he learned the hard way. Because when he tried to get rid of Six Music, out, he was forced by the audience, by the passion of the audience of Six Music, to rethink it. Now, in commercial radio, the competition increases every week. I've been spending a lot of time this week listening to Fix. Have you heard Fix?
I regret.
It is a new radio station for builders, right? It's a specialized radio station for builders, and it has builders music, which is quite the same as other stations. But it has a tone of voice. It has its own kind of advertisements. And in commercial radio, there is this new opening out of, if you can afford to get on transmitted radio, which they've just done, they're on DAB, Fixed Radio are asking their listeners to become co-owners. They're asking them to invest in this station. I've never heard of that before. That wouldn't have happened in the early days of LBC and Capital. LBC and Capital, once deadly rivals, are now, of course, owned by the same company.
Yes. 3
companies control all of commercial radio by and large. There's Global, owners of Capital and LBC, and there are the 2 others, one of them being the new Times Radio.
Mm-hmm.
And they are expanding and going in very interesting directions. Their television show at night, which has begun this week with Piers Morgan, I mean, why anybody would watch that? Another question. Anyway, they're leaning on their radio station for its later hours. They're mixing the 2 now. That's a very interesting way to go. Whether it will work, I don't know.
When you talk about the BBC and you express the hope, which is shared by us all, that the BBC cares as much about radio as it used to, obviously structures change, titles change. Tim Davie was managing director radio. That position per se no longer exists.
What a shame.
But there is, of course, there is another structure. But what is your concern? I mean, do you believe that there is a danger that radio is seen as an add-on? Because, of course, to a generation 50 years ago, radio was the foundation of everything to which television was added. Are you suggesting that it's now seen the other way around?
Radio is where, or audio rather, is where the great growth field is, and has grown up only in the last decade. And that is an area in which the BBC has invested heavily, has robbed radio budgets, or has sliced radio budgets, shall we say, not robbed, to invest in sounds. The BBC, as usual, was slightly ahead of the market by putting money into a form of broadcasting which, instead of it being table d'hote like the networks are, here's the menu for today, you know what it's like, you know what you will like, try something new today, today's special offer. This is a la carte. This is where you go in and you say, I like X, I'm going to listen to everything about X. Now, that's where the BBC has been very smart. It's expanded sideways into the bigger world of audio with sounds. And of course, once you get into that world, it is a bewildering forest. I find it bewildering. I can't go into the podcast world because I'm not sure of the way through the woods.
No,
am I going to find something I like, and will I stick with it? How will I find something new?
But it's quite interesting, Gillian, what you say about BBC Sound. I think there's been a great deal of discussion and argument internally about how it can be made to work better all the time, because it was a very, very new idea. But you're absolutely right, with all the knocking that the BBC gets, which as we know is a kind of national pastime in many ways, although that's only exceeded by the number of people who say, when they're asked, that they couldn't live without the BBC, that it was ahead of the game in digital terms in the 90s. I mean, John Burt, who got his fair share of criticism internally and externally, probably more than his fair share, was nonetheless ahead of the curve in understanding what was coming. Isn't that true? I know
yes, it is true.
Hadley, and you always defend him, but in this case, I think justifiably.
It is true. And the BBC has been very fortunate in its directors general. I tell you one thing I do worry about. And that is broadcasting house, because within the last few decades, the BBC sold the freehold of a new broadcasting house, and they're on a lease back. And I keep wondering how long that lease has got to run. It's something that might occupy members of the listeners and viewers to research this further, because I'm afraid I'm scared to go into that particular wood, because if the BBC's physical establishment goes, or they can't afford to lease back the building, what will happen, A, to the concept, and B, to the talismanic value of the BBC? Now, BBC Radio can't die completely. How would the world do without World Service? World Service cannot exist without that bigger organization beneath it. It is the most invaluable piece of quiet diplomacy that we use. So in a way, I'm optimistic about the BBC. In a way, I'm apprehensive about where it will live. I'm not apprehensive about the way it will remain part of people's appreciation, because generations coming up, as the Row Over Six music proved, will find their own niche within the BBC. Nobody plays more new bands than the various aspects of BBC One. Commercial radio, in its old form, coexists very happily with the BBC. They are addressing different markets, and people will choose between the two. You don't always shop at one shop, you shop at several. But in the world of sounds, that's unexplored territory.
Well, I think you make a very interesting point about the commercial sector there, because it seems to me one of the things about the radio side of it is that if someone wanted to provide, we're talking about speech radio, a sort of monochrome, very politically loaded radio station, one way or another, it seems to me that it wouldn't work. It wouldn't fly in the long run, because people who are listening to radio, perhaps for quite long periods in a day, they want a bit of light and shade. They want a bit of relaxation. They want a bit of stimulation. They want good sense in the end. Now, that may be just an optimistic, old radio hacks view, but I believe it to be true, don't you?
I think you're missing a bit of it. And that is, you want to feel that what you're listening to is friendly towards you. I find Radio 4 a bit off-putting from time to time these days, because it doesn't seem as if it's talking to me. Sometimes it's kind of condescending if it introduces a particular kind of program. And sometimes it feels as if it's, someone saying, "Hello, Grandma, let me help you off the bus." And I think, bugger off. I'm perfectly capable of getting off the bus.
Well, let me defend Radio 4 here. I mean, I think every controller of Radio 4, and Mo, the current controller, is facing the same set of questions that his predecessors did, is how to take it on to the next stage, how to let it grow and develop without sort of offending or upsetting the core audience. Now, you can't change anything without irritating or upsetting.
Oh, remember James Boyle's?
Well, James Boyle. And the truth is, there are some programs which come in and people say, well, this will never work. And suddenly it becomes part of the schedule. And then people say it's been there like the Tower of London.
Absolutely. Archive on 4, very good example. James Boyle Innovation, and is now an anchor in the week.
Well, you look at a program like More or Less, which seems to me to have found a place in the schedule that gives people something which they never got before, in that kind of thoughtful, persistent, revelatory way. And I think that's been the model for quite a lot of the new programming that's going on. And the problem, I think it's fair to put to you, Gillian, is that if you start to introduce new voices, inevitably people are going to say, "Where's old so-and-so?" But then after a little while, they say, "Well, it's not so bad." I mean, I remember, just a personal anecdote, I remember after I joined the World at One, I got a furious letter from a man in Alderney complaining about me in all sorts of ways, and how disgraceful I was. And his main complaint was that apparently I couldn't speak the Queen's English.
Oh, really?
So I wrote this excoriating reply, which I made the mistake of showing to my wife before I sent it. And she said, you mustn't send that. He's probably a poor old soul and, you know, you'll offend him and so on. Because I ended with a classic line, I may not speak the Queen's English, but at least I pay the Queen's taxes, because he was an Alderney. And I thought that was rather a good line. Anyway, I forgot about it. And just before Christmas, a Christmas card arrived, which is approximately 3 feet square. And it said, my name is so-and-so. I wrote you a very rude letter. All this. I have changed my mind. I now think you're okay. Now, everyone on radio could tell you a similar story. And I think you've got to give things time. And if Radio 4 didn't try to change, it would atrophy. It would be ridiculous. It would be.
Well, I would offer you an encouraging example of just what you said. And that is how Radio 3 has changed with every different controller.
Mm.
And I think the present controller, Alan Davey, has done a remarkable job in making Radio 3 accessible to a much younger audience. You listen on a Saturday. A lot of young presenters, you listen in the day. A lot of older Radio 3, more established Radio 3 listeners, not drift-ins like me, will say, oh, I don't like music. I don't like music. But they've every single controller that I can remember of Radio 3 over the last 4-5 decades has made changes, and changes that, as you say, you become accustomed to, and changes that are in step with bringing in new listeners. Well, it's just gradually, like the tide, bringing in, you know.
And it's particularly true in Radio 3 terms that you must do it without patronizing your listeners, because you're dealing with people who know the music, who know what they like, overwhelmingly, and they do not need to be told, you know, why, you know, Schubert was a great composer. On the other hand, you want to say to people, you're welcome here.
Without being
40 years ago,
Jim,
you should be listening to us. So you're good enough to listen to us.
Jim, without being excessively chummy. Remember the controller who came in and decided to make everything very conversational, and everyone reared up and went, "Argh!" And various presenters took themselves away and had a good sulk. But it doesn't mean we don't like them. It's just that they got it slightly wrong. Radio is a delicate art. It's a friend. It can be an antagonist. It can offer you a different point of view. It can soothe you. It can reinforce your prejudices, or it can challenge them. And it does it in a way that television just doesn't. And that's why I think it has a future. That's why I know the market invests in it. There wouldn't be such a radio audio boom if people didn't like listening to the sound of each other's voices and each other's songs.
Rennie Wyndham has sent us in a question saying neither Netflix nor Amazon Prime, ITV or any other competitors to the BBC provide a high quality of choice of radio programs, just the theme that you've been developing. And Rennie Wyndham asks, why is so little made of this when applying for the charter, and why is it not pointed out more positively when the license fee was being mentioned? Well, I mean, to be fair, I hope it is a major bit of the charter renewal argument, you know, as we go up to 27. It's bound to be, isn't it?
Oh, of course it is. Of course it is. Any good salesman would know that. The great thing is, does the government want to hear? I mean, it seems to me this government is eager to sell off anything. I'm not speaking politically now, but I think they've got themselves in such a financial hole that they're eager to flog off anything. Hence the talk of privatization of Channel 4. Oh, that's a hand of few million. You know, the talk of privatizing bits of the BBC will resurface, and it will be for that menial reason. It won't be for the good of the audience or the good of the population as a whole.
In my experience, as you approach a general election, talk of the BBC, the Archbishop of Canterbury, of getting immigrants to somewhere else and all the rest of it comes around, you know, like an absolutely predictable winter storm. I mean, it's nothing new under the sun, is there?
Well, I do think this Prime Minister is of a kind that, let us hope, is unique.
I'll let you do this bit, Julie.
I wouldn't trust him a foot, but that's only me. Obviously, other people do. And he will be seeking to get himself out of the most formidable financial hole and he will be looking to sell off anything that's handy.
Mm. If you were Tim Davie and you were looking at BBC Radio, what would you do?
I would talk it up a bit more. I'd go around and talk to the troops a bit. I would cheer the troops up. All the good directors general have done that. You would see, I remember being asked to be a guest commentator on a budget or something on the World at One, actually. And I went in, and sure enough, outside the door was hovering, outside the studio door, Ian Trithowan, who was then director of radio, and with him, Charles Curran. The good manager in any field comes round and talks to the staff and inspects the stock. So, Tim, I know you're doing it, but just do it a bit more.
And what you talked about Fix, which I found fascinating because I didn't know anything about it. What are you listening to with most pleasure at the moment? I mean, someone's asking, just while you think about that, Robin Jones has asked a question, what do you think of the new TV news stations like Talk TV, GB News and so on, who are then relaying that output as radio, which of course is, as we mentioned earlier, really heresy as far as you're concerned, isn't it?
Well, maybe it will take them a while to find it out. I mean, the Times people have some good radio people working for them.
They do.
But radio consisting of speech is very expensive in commercial radio terms.
Yeah.
And I don't think the management would be very happy with an audience of 500,000. Perfectly respectable for Times Radio, but they will want it to be more, and they will seek it to be more by being a bit more blatant. That won't work either. You've got to nourish what's in the garden, and you've got to go out and water the flowers and say, I wish the sun would come out on these, and it will. What am I listening to that I like? Well, I wake up every morning listening to Radio 5 Live, and then when that drives me mad, I turn over to the Today programme, which drives me mad. And then I turn over to Radio 3, which calms me down a bit. Then I turn to LBC and listen to Nick Ferrari, and I think, my goodness, he's good. He couldn't exist outside of commercial radio. He would be anathema to the BBC. But he's a brilliant interviewer and a wonderful communicator. And I listen to Matt Chorley's show on Times Radio. I find it irresistible. I don't find Woman's Hour irresistible anymore, alas. I don't know why. It keeps telling me things I already know. But anyway, I travel hopefully. At the weekend, I thought, oh, look at that. The BBC's got Hamlet on, it wasn't Hamlet. They had Antony and Cleopatra on Radio 3, and they had Macbeth on Radio 4, a Scots Macbeth, and a very Egyptian Cleopatra on Radio 3. And I thought, well, I'll listen to both of them. I bet they're rubbish. Well, they weren't. And all of a sudden, you listen to someone doing, the famous speeches, the ones you had to do for A-level and O-level, and you hear another voice doing it. And I've got gooseflesh now I'm thinking of it.
Well,
that's the charm of radio.
There's a lot of worry being expressed about radio drama in recent years because of budget cuts and so on. And I think there's still a lot of concern about what can be done but radio drama seems to me to be in fine fettle at the moment. I mean, there is still original work being done that's remarkable.
And everybody always forgets how much everybody owes to radio drama. I mean, I won't go through the list. Our audience will know as well as I do what they are. But half the people with shows in the West End have had big shows on BBC Radio. And BBC Radio has a role in finding and encouraging talent from the beginning. It goes beyond Joe Orton, but I mean, Joe Orton is a case in point. If it hadn't been for John Tiedeman's faith in Joe Orton might never have written again. And you find it again and again and again through the generations. And it's, when people leave it off their program or leave it off their book jacket, I get very cross and write them cross letters saying, don't forget, you were discovered by Radio 4.
Let me turn it around a little bit, Gillian, as we move towards the end of the session, because you were on the Telegraph for 42 years, as you pointed out, as radio critic. And radio criticism in the papers was important. It was an important strand in any of the serious newspapers, and indeed some of the less serious ones. Now, as with the constricted space given to theatre criticism, and certainly book reviews compared with 30 years ago, it's also true of radio criticism. Do you think that some of the oxygen is going out of the discourse about the trade we're in and what we're listening to?
No, I don't think the oxygen is going out of the discourse. I think what is happening is that owners of newspapers are cutting back on print and diversifying. Both the Daily Mail group and the Times group, the two big dominant groups, have formidable interests in other methods of communication.
Yes.
And you will see newspapers getting thinner and thinner and thinner in size. I mean, a month after I was informed that the Times no longer required my services, the person I worked for, who had invented the culture section, was also got rid of. And she had 42 years of experience on the paper. She knew the paper backwards. Everybody in the arts respected that section. But it was being cut and cut and cut. And you will see it still has, it just about has as much copy as advertising. And it's interesting. What's happening is print is becoming too expensive. Publishers are looking to invest in other means of communication, which is what makes the BBC's role even more important, because they stand apart from that world. They can afford to use their portion of the license fee in investing in new talent, in originating product, in composition, and in production. Because if anything distinguishes the average podcast from the average broadcast, it's the quality of production.
Well, indeed. And one of the things, somebody rang me up from a newspaper the other day and talked about, the brain drain, as it was being called in the public prints, with, Andy Marr and John Sopel, Emily Maitlis and others, big names going off in their cases to global, for, good money and big exposure and all the rest of it. And I said, well, look, I think that, like a football team, I mean, you can always lose people, and, however regrettable it is that they've gone, in all those cases, I feel terrible regret that they're not working in the same building as me, but they can be replaced, and they know that. But what is very difficult is when you get an experience drain, when you get people in their 40s who are good producers and just about to reach the peak of their creativity, when they, for one reason or another, leave, take voluntary redundancy or go somewhere else, you end up with a paucity of that kind of talent that can do exactly what you're saying, which is to turn, a good voice into a really brilliant voice, turn a decent script into something you want to hear, and craft a piece of sound radio, of audio, that is going to be memorable to a listener, whether they're in a car sitting at home.
But who you're talking to is crucial in that, because I will write something and I will think it's perfectly good and I will take it into the studio, and a good producer will say to me, have you thought, or could you, or do you mind if? And a good producer will guide you in ways.
Of course.
It's the second opinion and the one you value. What I dread is the lack of production in both sides of radio. I asked Eddie Mayer not too long ago, was he happy going to LBC? And he said, yes, I am happy. I'm very happy. I've got a wonderful producer. And I said, did you bring that producer with you? And he laughed and wouldn't tell me. But I think the big difference between working in commercial radio and working at the BBC is there isn't usually time to make that bond. When that bond between a producer and a broadcaster is made, it really shows in the output. The best of Times radio shows you can do it. The worst of LBC shows that some people will never learn. And, production is every bit as important as the actual broadcaster.
And remember, just as we finish, there's production, there is also the voice. And in the old days, it were some people who maybe were having difficulty. And the great Peter Donaldson, whose voice we all grew up with and knew and whom we loved, used to, literally take them into a darkened room in the basement. And 2 hours later, they would come out. And it's not a question of people talking the same way and all in RP, and that's nothing to do with it, but it's how to project and how to talk to a microphone. And I don't think there's enough of that done now.
The sharing of experience.
Exactly.
And that's really absolutely vital. And there will be people listening to this who know exactly what we mean. And thank you for it, by the way.
Well, thank you for it, Gillian. Gillian Reynolds, CBE, he said formally at the end, it's always a joy to talk wherever we meet and whenever we see each other, because I'm always aware that you have something to say. And even if it's sharp, you deliver it in your inimitable way. So what you've done for radio, all of us in the business know, in the last half century is extraordinary. It's a contribution that has gilded the whole business. And apart from being a very old friend, of which I thank you, I also think on behalf of everybody who works in the business, we know how much we owe you. Thanks very much for talking.
Thank you. Thank you.
Here, here, Jim. That was a beautiful winding up after a really excellent session. It's been fascinating to hear the two of you. Thank you both very, very much indeed. And we're proud to have Gillian as one of our patrons. So that was the final session, everybody, in today's conference. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thanks again to all our speakers and all the chairs for those sessions. Done a great job. Wanted just to note that our next event will be the VLV Awards for Excellence in Broadcasting. And I'm happy to say that we're having this as a live event this year. It'll be our first live event since all the pandemic stuff began. And that's happening on the 23rd of June at our normal venue of the Geological Society. So I hope as many of you as possible will sign up for that. More details will soon appear on our website and go to our mailing list. And then our autumn conference, we also hope will be in person, and that'll be on the 22nd of November. Do sign up to our mailing list if you're not already on it, if you're interested in these issues. And in particular, do seriously consider joining the VLV if you're concerned about the kind of issues. As we heard from Tim Davey earlier on, I think we do have a voice. We are able to influence policy. We are listened to. And if you want to play your part in that, the very best thing you can do is to join the VLV. It's only £30 a year. So I would hope as many of you as possible will do that. But certainly get on our mailing list. Don't also forget that to use our Twitter handle, which is @VLV, to tweet about the issues raised at the conference today. Finally, just thanks from me to all those in the VLV who've helped this make this possible, particularly Katie Birch, and also Sophie has been there as well. Sophie Chalk has been there as well, and all my colleagues on the VLV board. So thank you to everybody. Hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible on the 23rd of June at the Geological Society. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.